Okay, well, my name is Andy Moore. I'm making this video to accompany the PowerPoint for group number 5 with Jen McGrath, Anna Ballard, myself, and Ricky Richards. Again, this PowerPoint is meant to, or this video rather, is meant to accompany the PowerPoint that describes something called the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act. It's created under the Congressional Budget Office. This act requires the federal government and an imposition of federal mandates on lower governments without those lower governments having adequate funding. Basically, around 1988-99, the federal government was sometimes imposing new policies, rules, and procedures on local, state governments and tribal governments that just were really difficult to actually implement or impossible to actually implement because of the budgetary restrictions and the real hardships that those federal restrictions imposed on those local agencies. And because of that, around 1995, this act finally came into existence. Again, it's the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act that requires the federal government and these imposition of federal mandates on lower governments without first ensuring there's adequate funding to support the mandate. It's that simple. Some of the important sort of language from the act itself: federal agencies should review and evaluate planned regulations to ensure that cost estimates provided by the Congressional Budget Office will be carefully considered as regulations are promulgated. One primary objective should be to reduce taxes and spending at all levels and to end the practice of shifting costs from one level of government to another with little or no benefit to the taxpayer. Some of the specifics on this rule: if the aggregate amount of spending equals or exceeds $100 million, then the federal agency that promulgates the regulation on these lower local government agencies has to do a couple of things before they can do that. They have to justify it by showing which federal law is being used to promulgate the rule. They have to do both a qualitative and quantitative breakdown of the proposed spending to implement the rule. They have to figure out and give a thorough assessment of the costs of the future compliance and the disproportionate impact to state, local, or tribal governments. And that to provide documentation of the cooperative engagement between the federal, state, and local authorities so as to prevent sort of a tyrannical imposition of restrictive rules scenario. It basically creates an advisory commission that reviews the impact of new federal mandates on smaller government operations to assess their feasibility and fairness. It then provides a report on those findings with the expectation that the federal government will act on the findings of the report. I've already mentioned the history of it a little bit. 1970s, 1980s, Congress enacted over 500 new programs without direct federal funding. And of course, Congress can enact these federal programs, but who's actually going to execute those programs? The local state governments are. And they were getting kind of out of hand. So finally, in 1995, the UMRA is passed, which was meant to just curb this practice so as to stop imposing these unnecessary and over-the-top sort of federal mandates on local government. In 2013 to 15, the UMRA was first mandated, filling in loopholes and things like that. And as recently as 2022, further amendments were created to this act to close loopholes by broadening requirements to include direct costs, to reduce exemptions from federal agencies, and to increase the authority of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. And turns out this has some direct relevance today, even though this began way back in 1995. A 2020 report completed by the Congressional Budget Office reviewing the act that authorized this shows that the private sector mandates would increase administrative costs beyond the 2020 threshold in the UMRA. So they're acknowledging and they're identifying that they're going over the threshold was what then invoked the federal government needing to justify why the costs associated with executing this federal mandate would be justified given the costs. That gives an overall, so we've got about 10 references. That gives us a good overall picture of what it is that the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act does, who it's authorized by, and how it applies today and how it will continue to apply in the future. It helps to further separate powers between the federal government and the local governments so that the local government can do their job without undue imposition from the federal side of things.